In 1942, the world was burning. But in a quiet Connecticut town, 18-year-old Walt Hauser still believed the world could be saved by courage. He wasn't born into glory. His father ran a small repair shop. His mother kept the family together through the lean Depression years. Yet every time a plane droned across the New England sky, Walt looked up and felt something stirring, a calling. Pearl Harbor changed everything. The radio crackled with news of ships in flames, and that night, Walt made up his mind. He would fight. He would fly. At 18, he walked into the recruiting office, his heart thudding louder than the typewriter keys. The officer looked over his test results, near perfect marks, the kind of mind the Army Air Forces needed. But when the psychological examiner frowned and scribbled, "Not suited for fighter command," Walt's dream faltered. Fighters were for the bold, the fearless, or so they said. Instead, he was steered toward bombers, the flying fortresses, that carried 10 men and more responsibility than any boy should bear. Walt didn't argue. He saluted and signed. In that instant, a new destiny took flight. Training began in the sweltering fields of Mississippi. The air smelled of oil and nervous ambition. They called it the College of the Clouds. Each morning, cadets stumbled from wooden barracks to the flight line, squinting at the rising sun. Engines coughed awake, instructors barked over static-filled radios. Walt learned everything about navigation, formation, discipline, emergency drills, and the choreography of survival. He was serious, precise, calm under pressure. The pilot crews trusted instinctively, while others bragged about combat. Walt wrote home every week, quietly proud, quietly afraid. His 2 brothers were already in uniform, one in the Pacific, the other in Europe, and their mother kept 3 flags in the window, each starting silent prayer. Every letter began the same way: "We're doing fine, Mom. Don't worry." But she worried anyway. By the winter of 1944, Walt earned his wings and the silver bars of a second lieutenant. 20 years old, commander of a B-17 flying fortress, 4 engines, 10,000 rivets, and 9 souls who would depend on him completely. He was assigned to the 15th Air Force, Italy. His orders read simply, "Proceed overseas. Report to Lucera Airfield." When he boarded that transport for Europe, Walt Hauser wasn't thinking of medals or history. He was thinking of his brothers, his mother's trembling smile, and the simple promise he'd made the day he enlisted to come home. He just didn't know how high the price of that promise would be. Southern Italy, 1944. The war was entering its deadliest rhythm. Every dawn, the sky above the Adriatic turned into a highway of engines, hundreds of bombers clawing toward the heart of Hitler's empire. Walt Hauser's squadron, part of the 15th Air Force, was among them. Lucera Airfield was a sea of mud and metal. Men slept beside their aircraft, praying the rain would hold off long enough to get airborne. Mechanics worked through the night, patching bullet holes with tin and tape. The fortresses lined up like patient giants, their olive-drab paint scarred by flak and fire. Walt's plane was christened Lady Be Lucky. Irony wasn't lost on the crew. They knew luck was the only currency that mattered up there. The missions began with precision, routine, and dread. Take off at dawn, climb through icy clouds, form up over the Adriatic, and head north toward Vienna, Linz, or the Ploesti oil fields. From 20,000 feet, Europe looked peaceful rivers curling through farmland, villages untouched. But then, black puffs would bloom ahead, the telltale sign of German flak. "Flak at 12 o'clock!" The waist gunner would shout. Seconds later, the formation vanished in smoke and chaos. The first time it hit them, Walt's co-pilot screamed. A shard of metal tore through the cockpit glass. The altimeter spun wildly, warning lights flared. Walt gripped the yoke, steady as stone. "Hold her level," he ordered. No panic, no hesitation. They dropped their bombs, turned for home, and limped back over the Adriatic, one engine feathered, the smell of burnt hydraulic fluid thick in the air. Back at base, they counted the holes, 168 of them, not a single man dead. That night, Walt didn't celebrate. He just sat by the wing, cigarette trembling between his fingers, staring at the moonlit fuselage. Each mission after that got worse. German flak gunners grew sharper. The Luftwaffe still prowled me 109 seconds, and few 190 seconds diving out of the sun. Some crew never returned. The empty bunks told the story. Still, Walt flew. 20 missions, then 30. Command noticed quiet leadership, steady hands, no wasted words. He wasn't the loudest, but his crew trusted him completely. They called him the preacher, not for religion, but for the way he kept calm when hell broke loose. On their 43rd sortie, heading toward Munich, the bomb bay jammed. The fortress shuddered violently under the weight of live bombs. Most men would have bailed. Walt crawled into the bay himself, 20,000 feet up, freezing wind screaming through the open doors. He kicked the mechanism loose, bombs away. The plane leveled, the men exhaled. He never spoke of it later, but after that day, everyone knew Walt Hauser wasn't just lucky. He was born for the impossible. February 1945. The war's end was in sight, at least. That's what Command kept saying. But for the men of the 15th Air Force, the skies over Austria and southern Germany were still pure hell. That morning, Lucera's airfield shimmered under frost. Crews shuffled through briefings, coffee cups in hand, maps spread across wooden tables. The target, a marshalling yard outside Regensburg. Heavy flak expected, moderate fighter opposition. They'd heard it all before. Walt's crew climbed into Lady B. Lucky, faces pale, eyes quiet. The engines growled to life, 4 Wright Cyclones, shaking the air like thunder. As they rolled down the runway, Walt glanced at the sky, perfect blue. A good omen, he thought. But halfway to the target, things changed. At 22,000 feet, the radio crackled. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Focke-Wulfs swooped in from the sun, fast, precise, merciless. The formation erupted in traces. One B-17 exploded instantly with no parachutes. Walt's tail gunner screamed into the intercom. "They're coming again!" He banked hard, engines straining, but flak bursts began dotting the sky, black blossoms around them. The bombardier shouted coordinates, trying to stay steady. Then came the hit, a direct burst under the right wing. The aircraft lurched violently. "Fire! Feather number 3! Feather 3!" Walt yelled. The co-pilot obeyed, but the prop kept windmilling, the vibration tearing through the fuselage. Smoke filled the cockpit. Instruments shattered. The interphone buzzed with panic waste, gunner wounded, tail turret gone silent. Walt's voice cut through the chaos. Calm, commanding. "Hold formation. We're not dropping yet." They reached the target, bomb doors jammed halfway. Somehow, the bombardier got them loose. The payload dropped. A second later, another flak hit. This time, it is near the nose. The fortress buckled. "Bail out! Bail out!" Walt's command echoed through the intercom. The radio operator went first, then the waist gunners. The co-pilot hesitated. "What about you, Walt?" "I'll make sure she stays level," he said. Flames licked through the cockpit. The altimeter spun down 10,000 feet, 8,000, 5,000. Finally, he jumped. The cold tore the breath from his lungs. For a few seconds, the sky was silent, only the sound of wind and the faint roar of burning engines above. Then, the parachute snapped open. Below him, Bavaria stretched out like a frozen painting. Behind, Lady B. Lucky spiraled downward, his ship, his crew, his pride vanishing in a column of smoke. When Walt hit the ground, German farmers were already running toward him, pitchforks in hand. The Luftwaffe patrol arrived moments later. Hands raised, gun to his back, Walt Hauser became what no pilot ever wanted to be: a prisoner of war. For nearly a year, he'd ruled the skies. Now, behind enemy lines, his war was just beginning. They stripped him of everything: his flight jacket, his watch, even his wedding ring. He wasn't Lieutenant Walt Hauser anymore. Just prisoner number 1047, locked behind barbed wire under a grey German sky. Stalag Luft, I am name, whispered among captured airmen like a curse. Perched near the Baltic coast, it was cold, damp, and hopeless. Thousands of downed Allied flyers packed into wooden barracks, surviving on thin soup and Red Cross parcels when they came. Guards with rifles, dogs, and orders to shoot without warning. Walt arrived, bruised and half-frozen, his parachute still wet from the February snow. The guards laughed when they saw his bruised face and burned flight jacket. "Flieger! Amerikaner!" one shouted. They shoved him toward a long row of huts, his boots sinking in the mud. Inside, the smell hit him first: sweat, smoke, desperation. Yet amid it all, there was something else: defiance. The men of the camp still stood straight when the guards passed. They joked, traded scraps of chocolate, and carved chess pieces of firewood. Some had been there for years. Their strength wasn't in their bodies anymore, but in their refusal to break. Walt found his bunk beside a British navigator named Mills. The man had been shot down over Bremen months earlier. That night, as wind howled through broken boards, Mills handed him half a biscuit and said, "Welcome to the club, Yank. Rule 1 never shows the Jerrys you're afraid." Days blurred into weeks. The guards counted them each morning, barking in German. Rumors spread through whispers: Russians are moving west. Patterns across the Rhine. Hope became their only rations. To stay sane, Walt started sketching aircraft on scraps of paper: B-17 seconds, Mustangs, even the enemy Fokker-Wulfs. The other men called him the artist. It was a way to remember who he was: a pilot, not a prisoner. Then came the winter of starvation. The supply lines broke down. Red Cross parcels stopped arriving. Men grew gaunt, hollow-eyed. Frost crept inside the huts. One night, a guard tossed a dead rat over the fence and laughed. They cooked it anyway. Yet in that misery, humanity survived. When a new prisoner arrived, shaken and crying, Walt gave him his blanket. When a British flyer fell sick, Walt traded his cigarette rations for medicine. He became the quiet center of that small, battered brotherhood. In April 1945, they woke to silence. No guards, no barking dogs. The gates hung open. From the east, the sound of engines, Soviet tanks rolling in. The war had ended, but when the camp doors swung open, Walt Hauser didn't cheer. He just stared at the horizon, gaunt and hollow, wondering how much of himself he'd left behind those fences. May 1945. Europe was free. The flags waved, the bands played, and the newspapers called them heroes. But for men like Walt Hauser, the celebration felt distant. He stepped off the transport ship at Boston Harbor, a skeleton in uniform. His mother was waiting, tears in her eyes, clutching the same faded telegram she'd prayed would never come true. When she saw him, she didn't speak, she just held on, afraid that if she let go, he might vanish again. For a while, he tried to fit back in. He married his sweetheart, found work at a small engineering firm, even joined the local American Legion. On the surface, life returned to normal. But late at night, when the town was quiet, his wife would hear him mutter in his sleep names, coordinates, the whine of engines. He never spoke about the camp, never mentioned the friends who didn't make it back. When people asked about the war, he'd shrug and say, "We just did what we had to do." But sometimes, when a plane passed overhead, he'd stop mid-sentence, eyes locked on the sky just for a moment before forcing a smile. The military called it battle fatigue. Today we'd call it trauma. Back then, you were expected to shake it off, be grateful you survived. But the ghosts of Stalag Luft, the faces of his crew, never really left him. One evening, years later, a neighbor boy found him polishing an old compass, the one he'd carried through every mission. "You ever miss flying, Mr. Hauser?" the kid asked. Walt smiled faintly. "Every day," he said, "but sometimes I still feel like I'm up there." Time moved on, the world forgot. Jets replaced the fortresses, new wars came and went, yet Walt stayed grounded, humble, never seeking medals or recognition. To him, survival was enough of an honor. In 1990, long after most of his generation had faded into memory, a historian tracked him down. He wanted to record his story for the local museum. Walt hesitated, then quietly agreed. When the camera started rolling, he sat straight-backed, hands folded, voice steady. He spoke not of combat, but of friendship, of the men who shared the cold, the fear, the sky. And when the interviewer asked what kept him going through those years as a prisoner, Walt looked down for a long moment, then said softly, "Hope. Not that I'd live, but that if I didn't, someone else would make it home." For Walt Hauser, the war never truly ended. It just changed altitudes from the roar of engines to the silence of memory. In the years that followed, Walt Hauser's name faded from public record, just another line in the archives of the 15th Air Force. No statues, no parades. Yet for those who knew him, his story lived on in the way he carried himself. The quiet dignity of a man who had looked death in the eye and refused to surrender his humanity. He never boasted about missions flown or medals earned. In fact, when his grandson discovered his old flight jacket in the attic, the boy thought it was just a relic from some forgotten pilot. Inside the pocket, they found a small scrap of paper, yellowed, folded, fragile. It was a hand-drawn sketch of a B-17, the same kind he'd drawn in the prison camp. Beneath it, just 3 words, "Still flying high." That discovery sparked something. The family began piecing together his wartime record, the 43 missions, the crash over Bavaria, the year in captivity. Only then did they realize the scale of what he'd endured and the kind of man he truly was. History often celebrates the loud, the decorated, the ones who make the headlines. But the soul of victory belongs to men like Walt Hauser, the ones who came home quietly, carrying invisible scars, their courage written not in medals, but in endurance. Each time, vintage B-17 roars across an airshow sky, it's not just an aircraft. It's a ghost of every pilot who once trusted his life to its wings, men who laughed, prayed, and sometimes vanished into smoke. Walt's story is a reminder that behind every mission log and casualty report, there was a beating heart, a mother's hope, a promise to come home. Today, if you visit Lucera, Italy, the old airfield is mostly gone weeds and ruins where once 1,000 engines thundered. But if you listen closely, on a quiet morning, you might swear you hear the echo of those flying fortresses climbing into the dawn. And somewhere, among them, maybe, just maybe, Lady Be Lucky still flies. Because some stories don't end. They just keep circling back, high above the clouds, reminding us of what courage once sounded like.